I'm Eric Rosales. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, day in court. Former President Donald Trump is arraigned in a New York City courtroom. We'll have a report and reaction. Runoff election. Voters head to the polls in Wisconsin in a race that could have a huge impact on abortion. Cause for concern. Why officials in the Holy Land are asking for increased security leading to Easter Sunday. And a sign of hope. The faithful in Spain take part in a traditional Holy Week ceremony. These stories and much more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Eric Rosales in for Tracy Sable. Our top story tonight, former President Donald Trump faces a judge in New York City, and for the first time, we're learning what the criminal charges were filed against him. It's a story that's drawing reaction from across the country, including right here in Washington, D.C. For the very latest, let's check in with White House correspondent Owen Jensen. Owen.
Eric, good evening to you. We witnessed history today when former President Donald Trump was brought to court in New York City, Secret Service agents at his side. Former President Donald Trump travels from Trump Tower to a courthouse in New York City to face criminal charges, his every move watched by people on the ground and in the air. The former president writing, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse seems so surreal. Wow, they're going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America. MAGA. Video cameras capture the former president entering the courthouse, and still cameras later show Trump sitting with his attorneys. Former President Trump vows to continue his campaign for the White House, where this afternoon Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters,
"We are just not going to comment on an ongoing case from here, and we've been very consistent, we've been very prudent, and we're going to stick there."
President Joe Biden recently told me on the South Lawn he has no comment about the indictment possibly further dividing the country. Also today, President Biden held a science and technology event at the White House looking at the pros and cons of artificial intelligence and its impact on individual Americans as well as national security. And back to former President Donald Trump. He's due back in court in December of this year, and he was scheduled to return to his Palm Beach, Florida home tonight, Mar-a-Lago, to give remarks. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you so much, Owen. Well, let's check in with Zack Smith, legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, who is also a former assistant U.S. District Attorney in Florida. Zack, welcome back. Now, take us through what happened today legally.
Yeah, this is a standard part of the criminal process. After someone has been charged with a crime, formally indicted, as Donald Trump has been, they go for an arraignment where they learn about the charges against them officially, conditions of bail or pretrial release are set. And so this was all part of the standard process, but in a very unprecedented manner. I mean, again, we've never before in our nation's history had a former president who's been indicted on criminal charges. And so even though arraignment is a standard part of any criminal process, it took place in a very unprecedented case.
And what did you think of the former president's decision to appear in court today rather than staying in Florida and fight the charges from there?
Well, look, he's certainly entitled to appear in person as the defendant in the case. But I think what's important to keep in mind here, again, not only the unprecedented nature of the charge, but also what we know about the charges, how they contrast with Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney's usual stance on many criminal justice issues. Alvin Bragg came into office pledging not to prosecute many misdemeanors, pledging not to seek jail time, even for many repeat violent offenders. And based on the indictment we've seen, essentially, Donald Trump is being accused of falsifying certain business records, which makes everyone wonder if the defendant's name wasn't Donald Trump, would Alvin Bragg have even pursued this case?
Well, I think we know the answer to that, but take us through these charges of the former president that he's facing. I mean, 34 charges.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot, but it looks like, and I've only had time to briefly review the indictment, it looks like essentially each false business record, alleged false business record, was listed as a separate charge. And again, I think it's important to keep in mind that based on what we know publicly, the indictment itself wasn't very illuminating. It didn't really add much beyond what we already knew. But essentially, Donald Trump is being accused of falsifying business records and doing so with the intent to conceal another crime. Now, the indictment doesn't list what that other crime is, but there's wide speculation that it would be a potential federal campaign finance violation. And so it's odd that you would have potentially a state court prosecution proceeding and being predicated on a federal campaign violation that the U.S. Department of Justice itself chose not to pursue.
And, the media out there expected Donald Trump to make some sort of statement, but he did not, I'm sure, at the advice of his attorneys. Tell us more about that. That's something that anything he says could be used against him, correct?
Well, it can be. That's part of the standard Miranda warnings every criminal defendant gets. I don't think Donald Trump has always heeded his lawyer's advice not to speak. And so I'm sure it was a welcome development in this case that he did. And I suspect we'll hear his side of the story, if he gives a speech at Mar-a-Lago or in other places in a much more structured format. But look, I think it's important to realize, an arraignment, it's a serious proceeding. It's certainly, even though these appear to be novel charges being brought against him, trumped up charges, some would say, it's still very serious, and he is facing criminal liability. And so I think given that, it was appropriate in the way that he handled it there at the courthouse today.
And we're almost out of time here, but what happens next? Talk to us about that. How could this have any effect on the 2024 campaign?
Well, look, I think we're going to see a lot of pretrial litigation taking place. One of the first things I suspect that Donald Trump and his lawyers will ask for is a change of venue. There's widespread speculation that he cannot get a fair trial in Lower Manhattan. I think that speculation is with some merit. And so I suspect we'll see a motion for change of venue. We'll see other pretrial motions as well. And we are a long way from the finish line in this case. And don't forget, there's still the federal case with the special counsel, Zack Smith, as well as the case being potentially pursued by Democratic District Attorney Fani Willis in Fulton County, Georgia, there in Atlanta.
And very quickly, Zach, tell us about some of the other stories that you're following right now.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the Supreme Court. My colleague and I, we actually have a new book out. It'll be out on June 27th called Rogue Prosecutors, where we highlight many of the progressive prosecutors around the country, their disastrous policies, the disastrous consequences of those policies. And we actually have an entire chapter in the book devoted to Alvin Bragg. We talk about his background, the policies he's implemented, and again, the devastating consequences those policies have had on New Yorkers.
We have to wait and see what those consequences are going to be. But Zack Smith, legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for your insight.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.
Well, voters in in Wisconsin head to the polls today for what is known to be the most expensive judicial race in U.S. history. Voters will decide the outcome of the state Supreme Court race. The heated contest will likely determine the fate of abortion access, voting rights, and years of other GOP policies. The result could break a decade-long era of Republican dominance in the nation's most important swing state. Well, Florida's Republican-led Senate passed a 6-week abortion ban. The bill could now head to the governor's desk as early as this week. The Sunshine State currently has a law banning abortions after 15 weeks. Governor Ron DeSantis has signed his support for the pro-life measure. Up on Capitol Hill, Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville is standing strong. He told me that he's not budging. He continues to hold up military nominations until the Department of Defense changes its abortion policy. Right now, the Pentagon is allowing troops to use U.S. taxpayer dollars for abortion-related travel expenses.
And all of a sudden, because of Roe Wade, they're kind of getting around the law by saying, okay, if we can't do it there, we'll just do it in the military. And so my whole deal is, don't worry about the abortion. It's the taxpayers having to fund it, and it's wrong.
The DOD has long permitted abortions for rape, incest, and the mother's health. In a tweet, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer accused Senator Tuberville of violating women's rights to make their own decisions. Quote, GOP Senator Tuberville is blocking 180 military promotions and putting U.S. security in jeopardy because he objects to women in the military accessing reproductive care. He's telling women in the military they're not allowed to make their own health care decisions. This is wrong. At a recent Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin defended the new policy, warning that the blocking of military promotions threatens national security.
We could be in a contest on any one given day. Not approving the recommendations for promotions actually creates a ripple effect through the force that makes us far less ready than we need to be.
But Republican Senator Mike Lee says the policy is illegal and adds Congress makes laws, not federal agencies.
Let this be a message to Secretary Austin. If you want to make the laws, run for Congress, but you can't legislate from the E-ring at the Pentagon. You cannot do that. Until then, stand down and leave the lawmaking to lawmakers.
So how important is this, folks? Listen to this. Several studies have found that the DoD averages about 20 abortions annually and projects that that number could actually jump to 4,000 per year under the new military guidelines. Senator Tuberville says that he is representing U.S. taxpayers and won't back off his demands. We'll keep you updated. Well, we still have a lot more to come on EWTN News Nightly, including a historic day. Finland officially becomes a member of the world's largest and biggest security alliance. What NATO officials are saying about the decision. Plus, we'll take a look at why 360 million Christians around the world face high levels of persecution and discrimination. Hey, welcome back. Finland officially becomes a member of NATO.
This will make Finland safer and NATO stronger.
President Joe Biden and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg have both applauded the move. The Nordic country previously had remained neutral. Finland's leaders called today the start of a new era.
Часть белорусских самолетов штурмовой авиации получили способность.
Russia's defense minister says Finland joining the military alliance, quote, risks a significant expansion of the war in Ukraine, but adds that the move will not affect the conflict's ultimate outcome. The general also says Moscow has modern warplanes that are capable of launching nuclear strikes. Both the United States and South Korea held a joint military drill today. Meanwhile, North Korea has increased its threats to use missiles against its rivals. North Korea recently unveiled a new type of nuclear warhead that can be launched from submarines. This prompted the anti-submarine drills from both the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. Last month, North Korea held a series of missile tests in response to military drills by the United States and South Korea. The head of the Archdiocese of San Francisco held a prayer service last night for religious freedom advocates in Hong Kong. Archbishop Salvatore Corleone held an hour-long prayer service for Cardinal Robert Zen and Jimmy Lai and other Christians facing persecution by the Chinese Communist government. The Archbishop of San Francisco covers an area whose population is about 30% Chinese. Church leaders in Jerusalem are calling for enhanced security measures during Holy Week. In a joint statement issued last week, several faith leaders are asking government officials to increase security as Easter approaches. There are fears that violence could take place in the Holy Land. Israeli officials have said that the country places a priority on the freedom of worship for all faiths. There are also concerns for the faithful in Europe, where persecution and intolerance against Christians is becoming more common. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Thonhauser recently spoke with the head of the organization that tracks discrimination against Christians in Europe.
Martin, you are working especially on the situation of Christians, of discrimination against religion, but also on hate crimes. What's the situation like in Europe right now?
Europe has unfortunately become a place, a dangerous place for many Christians who are engaged in public life on the one side. So this means that, for instance, freedom of conscience or freedom of speech is limited or at least threatened by laws and by the media bias in Europe. And then we have really anti-Christian hate crimes, which you find especially in France, Germany and Spain, when you see on the in the area of vandalism against churches. So these are two main areas where Christians are affected in public space, but we have also more subtle threats against against religious freedom in general, but especially freedom of Christians. For instance, if you think about so-called buffer zones in front of abortion places, like where it's forbidden to pray or even to be there, maybe to talk to people. This is a growing issue in many countries, and we have educational rights who are affecting the freedom of parents to educate their children regarding sexual education, gender education, for instance. And then there's a growing phenomenon among Christian converts from Islam, especially in the immigrants communities, where it is dangerous if you live as a Christian Arab, for instance, in a community which is dominated by Muslims.
Also here in Europe, well, we know that religious festivities also provoke kind of violence against religion. What about Easter?
Easter is, of course, more dangerous in countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, where there were many attacks and even many people killed in the recent history. Like 4 years ago, in Easter Sunday alone in Sri Lanka, 250 people were killed in the cathedral and 2 other churches. And the Western media stayed very calm on that and tried not to make an issue, and they just said, yeah, this bombs against traveling, praying people, which is not really the adequate description of this, because it was a Islamistic attack against Christians in a church. And we have other phenomena which, but in Europe, I think Eastern is not a dangerous issue. It's just the reaction against persecution against Christians in the world, which is so disappointing in Europe.
You have come here to Rome. You are the president of the think tank, also going against the hate crimes and discrimination of Christians. What could the Vatican do?
The Vatican has a good, important role in diplomacy, in the United Nations, in the European institutions. Of course, not as a decision maker, but I think the diplomats from the Holy See, like in the nunciatures, could use their influence, because in many countries the church has a standing, and of course what the Holy See should do is to encourage the bishops to use their local authorities to talk to politicians and journalists openly.
Martin, thank you so much for your work and for everything you do, and all the best also in the future.
Thank you so much.
We continue to pray for peace. Well, up next on EWTN News Nightly, speaking out, the U.S. bishops addressed the church's preference on burial, what they're saying about some of the new methods like human composting. Plus, the traditional procession. Yeah, we take a look at a special Easter-related event in Spain. Take a listen to this next story. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is speaking out against some of the newer forms of burying the deceased. In a recent statement, the USCCB raised the alarm over the methods like human composting. They say it not only shows disrespect to the human body, but it falls short on respect for the dead, which is a requirement by the Catholic faith. Human composting is legal in a handful of states, most recently in California. Let's check in with Robert Seelig, CEO and founder of the Catholic Funeral and Cemetery Services. Robert, great to have you with us. First off, tell us more about this human composting. I mean, is it like turning grandmother into a rose bush or something?
Well, hi, Eric. First off, it's nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Just a little bit about Catholic Funeral and Cemetery Services. We are a nonprofit owned by the church, operated basically to serve the Catholic Church across the United States. So we operate funeral homes and cemeteries. And so as you talk about disposition of human remains, the church has always taught that burial was the preference. And as technology changes, we start to hear about new things. So cremation was permitted after Vatican II, it's permissive, but the preference has always been burial, just as Christ was laid in the tomb and we come upon Good Friday, it reminds us of that burial practice. And so when you bring up human composting, our minds move to gardening and to rose bushes. And so the bishops came out with, actually the Vatican asked the U.S. Conference of Bishops to actually issue some doctrine on this, just so that Catholics could understand what these new technologies are and understand what they mean and how they apply to their lives. So there were two kind of technologies that have more recently been approved in various states. One is human composting. Human composting is actually the placement of a body in a cylinder where soil is placed in it and other organic materials. And over a period of 30 days, the body is kind of rotated and broken down into soil. And what you end up with is basically a cubic yard of soil. And what the companies are that are promoting this are suggesting that you take the soil and spread them wherever you want, in your lawn or rose garden or somewhere else, or use it in a planter. And so the bishops were asked to actually just come back and speak to that issue, which is just that, it's not the proper treatment of human remains, that we don't actually bury them in a cemetery, that we don't have the dignified, the dignity of the human body is not respected in the process. And so therefore we're left with this kind of problem in the way that we kind of deal with the remains.
Well, you are certainly a leading Catholic voice on funerals and burying the dead out there, but talk to us a little bit about, are these trends, are we starting to see a lot of these trends? Is it popular?
Yeah. Well, I think that the best way of putting it is that as we become more ecologically minded in our country, there's businesses, and businesses want to take advantage and promote new programs. So in many ways, with the burial of the dead, there's a desire to look at alternative technologies. But the reality is that we have some of those solutions already in place, right? We have our Catholic cemeteries. You can have the body cremated and reducing space and place those in a Catholic cemetery as well. There are also what are called green burial sections, where you can actually take the remains of the body and rather than embalming it or placing it in a casket, you can actually bury it in a green burial section in a cemetery. So there have been responses to it, but as with all good ideas, there's new ideas that come along that sometimes have some theological issues that the bishops need to address.
Most definitely. And in some countries, it's just a matter of space, correct?
Yeah. The tradition in Europe, where we had cemeteries for, over 1,000 years, is that as those cemeteries fill, they have a process whereby they remove the remains and condense them and still keep them in the cemetery in an appropriate manner. And so often we reuse those graves in Europe and other places. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we don't have an issue of land or space, so we still have the appropriate ways to deal with these issues. But as we all look at carbon footprint and other issues, there's always kind of new, more secular technologies that are kind of pushing the envelope.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. Robert Seelig, CEO and founder of the Catholic Funeral and Cemetery Services. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Eric.
And finally, tonight, Holy Week is well underway. And in one city in Spain, the faithful took part in a traditional procession. The faithful lined the streets of Toledo for the procession of the Christ of Hope. It is one of several related traditions in the historic city. One tourist group says Toledo offers the most spectacular Holy Week in the entire country. Well, we want to thank you so much for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook and Twitter, and even Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Eric Rosales. Have yourself a wonderful night, and God bless.